We're in part 2 of a series called Thoughts of an Inmate. We're going through the book of Philippians. And before we start talking about the book of Philippians, I want to start off with another Bible story. And it's a story in the Old Testament. And it's from the book of Genesis. Surprise, surprise. Here we go. This is where the story takes place. Okay, now if you don't know what we're looking at right now, this is the Mediterranean Sea. The Tigris and Euphrates are over there. Right? So this is where we're at. Israel, current day Israel's over here. And Italy's here, Greece. Okay. So this story takes place in a place called Dothan, which is, next slide. Let's zoom in. It's right around there. Okay. We don't know exactly, but it's around there. And this story starts in Dothan, but it ends down here in a place called Egypt. And this is a story about a guy named Jacob, who eventually had a family. And in his family, he had, next slide, 12 sons. 12 sons. And these 12 sons, well, apparently Jacob had a favorite. Okay, like, you shouldn't do that, but he did. And he didn't just like subtly say that he had a favorite. He made it very clear. And it's the second youngest, which is this guy right here. His name is Joseph. Okay? And he made it so clear, in fact, that, next slide, that the other 11 kind of stood as, like, okay, he's the guy. He's our competition. We want to make sure that if you want our dad to love us, he's the one that's in the way. We want to make sure that he's out of the way. Now, the oldest is the one that's responsible for making sure his dad is happy. So when the other brothers started talking about, okay, how do we get our dad to love us more? They said, you know what? I think the best way to do it is to get rid of dad's favorite. Let's get rid of Joseph. And like, what do you mean by get rid of? It's like, well, like kill him. And so the oldest one is like, but that'll break dad's heart. Let's not do it. And so the oldest, his name is Reuben, he had an idea. His idea was, instead of killing him, let's toss him, next slide, into this cistern, this hole, this well, depending which translation you read, same idea. They kept water in a hole in the ground, a cistern. And they straight up said that, the Bible says, right after this, they had a picnic. You know, they just start eating, like, okay, well, what should we do with him now that he's in there? And as they were doing that, next slide, a traveler came by with a camel. And he had all these spices on him. It's like, oh, you're a merchant. You sell and buy stuff. And so the brothers got together and had this idea. It's like, hey, what if we, just hear me out, instead of killing him, because that would break dad's heart, we tell him that he's dead, but in reality, he's not really dead. We actually are going to sell it to him. That way, there's at least something in it for us, right? We get something in return. And so next slide, they said, whoever came up with that idea, you're a genius. Not really smart, but they thought, when 11 guys get together and come up with an idea, it usually sounds something like this, right? So they said, okay, 1, 2, 3, break. That's our game plan. Next slide. So they said, here, come out here. He's all yours. And after that, we don't know much about what happened to the brothers, but if you go to the next slide, we find out that this merchant guy, he traveled south to Egypt. Now, let's take a break in the story right here and just go over what just happened here. Do you think that these brothers did this by accident? No. This is like totally intentional. They meant evil to happen, right? It wasn't like, whoops, we slipped and threw him into the cistern. Oh my gosh, we made a mistake and we just accidentally sold him into slavery. Like, none of this is accidental. All of this is intentional. They had a choice to do evil or not evil, and they always chose to do evil. And so Joseph at this point in the story is thinking, life didn't have to go this way. If it wasn't for these brothers who chose to do evil instead of good, I could still be with my dad right now. Like, that's what's going through his mind right now. Okay, now let's continue the story. So this traveler, next slide, eventually gets to Egypt. And when he gets to Egypt, he's looking for people to buy his new slave. And he discovers this couple. Next slide. We have this couple. We don't know the wife's name, but the husband's name is Potiphar. And Potiphar is a very, very successful person. He is a personal advisor. He works at the high ranks to the Pharaoh, which is the king of Egypt. And in this story, one day, next slide, they bought the slave. There you go, it's all yours. And then he just takes off. Okay, we don't know what happened to that camel later. We don't know what happens, but okay. Now, as the story goes, next slide, the husband, he has to go to work. So he went to report to the Pharaoh. And while he was at work, his wife decided, hey, you looking kind of good, Joseph. And he kind of slowly moves, she's like, hey, so how you doing? And he's like, not much. Now, what the story tells us about Joseph is that Joseph was working really, really well with his master. He accepted the fact that he was a slave, and he did his best to serve his master. And he's like, and the master noticed it, and Potiphar's like, you are my number one slave. You worked your way up in the slave rankings. You're like at the top. You're really good. Okay, not to say that slavery is good at all, but in this story, he made the best of the situation, right? And so when his wife came over and said, hey, I'm sure it was more seductive than that, but he's like, hey, how would you like to with me? Let's go, and my husband's not home. He was like, I can't betray my master. He likes me, right? And I can't do this to you. You're married. I can't do this. So what did Joseph do? Next slide. He basically says, bye. Now the husband eventually comes home, and he's like, where's Joseph, my favorite slave? Where is he? Joseph, where are you? And then the wife is like, well, his cloak is here. How should I explain this to my husband? And she's like, comes up with this idea. He came on to me, and I fought him off, and he ran away. And here, look at this cloak. This is proof that he did this to me, which is not proof at all, but, he takes off, right? And now Potiphar is angry. Like, what? Now, time out in this story. Was this done by accident? No. Potiphar's wife meant to do this. She had a choice of being honest, saying, I did the wrong thing and we lost your slave, right? Or she could have lied and intended evil and cast blame on somebody who didn't deserve it. So again, this was not an accident. This was intentional, okay? So eventually they find Joseph, and Potiphar's not happy with him and says, I don't want to hear your excuses. My wife told me exactly what happened, which is a lie. And it's like, you know what I'm going to do with you? Because I'm the most powerful, or second, third most powerful person in the whole kingdom of Egypt. I'm going to send you to jail, and you're going to be there for a long time. So next slide. So Joseph ends up in jail. Now, at this point, scholars can't agree on how long he's actually in jail. Some scholars say 3 years. There are other scholars that say 13 years. Let's just say somewhere in between. He's there for a long time. A year in prison in Egyptian conditions was terrible. Imagine 3 years of that to 13 years. It's terrible. And he's there for a very, very long time. By the way, this is the abridged version. There's a lot of details I'm skipping over. So he's in there for a long time. And then one day, Pharaoh, next slide, has a dream. He has a dream, and he's convinced that this dream is important, but he just can't understand it. So he's asking around, what do you think this dream means? Nobody could give him an answer. So somebody tells him, hey, Pharaoh, there's a guy in jail named Joseph. I heard that he's really connected with God, and he could interpret dreams. It's like, really? It's like, well, bring him out. So he brings him out, and he tells him the dream. And Joseph's like, let me pray about that. He prays about it. He comes back and says, I think I know what that dream means. And he explains. And this is what he says. He says that what the dream means is that right now we're living in a really nice kingdom. You have everything you ever want is right here. But in a few years, not right now, but a few years, there's going to be a famine. Now, in case you don't know what a famine is when everything could grow. Like if you plant a seed, things will grow, right? But there's going to come a time when it's going to be hard to make food. You're not going to be able to grow the carrots that you want. You're not going to be able to grow whatever, you're not going to have any animals left. You're going to be hungry. And when the world goes hungry, what happens? People start attacking each other. They start robbing from each other. I want more bread, so I'm going to kill you to get it, right? And there's going to be this famine. Chaos is going to break out in Egypt, and Egypt's going to fall. And Pharaoh's like, well, we can't have that happen. We're the most powerful nation in the world. We can't have that happen. Joseph, what should we do? Joseph. And Joseph is like, here's what I think we should do. Because right now we're not in a famine, let's grow as much as we can. We'll build a storehouse, and we'll put everything in there. So when the famine actually hits, we could release a little bit of food and give it to the people around us, and we're going to be fine. So a few years later, sure enough, that happens. The waters can't drink that much of the water anymore. The plants aren't growing anymore, right? And the livestock aren't, reproducing or making milk. I don't know what they do. I'm not a farmer, but all that stuff stopped. And so they're like, Joseph, you were right. You are so important to us. And so eventually this Pharaoh, next slide, I don't think they wore crowns back then, but he said, you are the second most important person in Egypt. Now, as it turns out, this famine was a lot worse than they imagined because, next slide, Remember how Joseph came from Dothan all the way down here? Well, it turns out Dothan is hit with the same famine, and they get hungry. And so remember the 11 brothers and the dad? Well, they're like, we're hungry. Hey, I heard that Egypt, they have a lot of food to spare. Maybe we should migrate down there. And so the whole family, they come down here to Egypt. And when they get there, next slide, so they come before the Pharaoh and says, hey, we're hungry, we need some food. And then Pharaoh's like, Joseph, you take care of it. Now, by then, the 11 brothers has forgotten the face of Joseph. So they have no idea that they're actually talking to their brother that they stole into slavery. So they're like, oh, great, second in power, Pharaoh's second in command person. We would love to have some food from you. Okay, let's stop right here. What do you think is going through Joseph's mind right now? These aren't people who accidentally sold him into slavery, okay? These are the people who intentionally chose evil to hurt the brother just so that they could get something more, right? If we got rid of him, then we will have more, right? What do you think is going through Joseph's mind? Remember, he's the second most powerful person in the entire known world. He's like, well, I have all the power in my life. Like, I could do whatever I want. This is my chance for revenge. I could make their lives miserable. There's a lot of people here who are working, and they would probably love to have some slaves. I have 11 brothers here that I could sell into slavery like they did to me, right? He could have chosen anything. But this is what Joseph said. Okay, now this is really important. This is the theme for today. You intended harm for me. Intended meaning you chose this. You had a choice to not do this, but you chose this. You intended to hurt me, harm me. But God intended it for good. To accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. You intentionally chose evil against me. I don't know how, but God took that intended evil and made it into something that saved the world. So as the story goes, Joseph chose to forgive his brothers. And he made a vow that he said, for as long as I live, and Joseph lived for a long time, I'm willing to take care of everybody here as long as I can. What was meant for destruction, God created opportunities for something beautiful to come out of it. Other Bible writers, later in the Bible, in the Old Testament, will use words like, out of the ashes, God could somehow bring beauty out of it. And this is a really interesting idea that, wait a minute, there's nobody in this story who is trying to make something bad into good. So Joseph looks back and says, if nobody was trying to make, if in the story, there's only people who are trying to do bad things on purpose, right? There's nobody that was like a freedom fighter saying well, I'm here to set there's nobody there that's intentionally trying to make good things happen in this story. But something good came out of it. So Joseph's conclusion is, if nobody in this story was trying to save me, but I somehow got saved, and along with me, the whole world was saved, it must have been God. So how does he do that, right? And not only that, Joseph is able to make this conclusion because everything in the story happened, and at the end of the story, he looked back and said, now that I look at everything, I realized that it was God who's taking the bad things in life and bringing something good out of it. So Joseph had the advantage of hindsight. He was able to look back, and for those of you who have lived life very long, you could look back at your life and say, that was intended for evil, somebody was purposely trying to hurt me there, but if it wasn't for those things, I wouldn't be where I am today. And I don't know how that happened. It must have been God, right? In hindsight, everything makes sense. But what if you're not at the end of the story? What if you're in the middle of it, right? Because we know that it is not easy to have this confidence while we're in that scary story. While Joseph is in prison, or while he's at the bottom of the hole of the cistern, right? Could he have said, oh, this is going to be fine because, God's going to make something good out of this, right? You don't have that confidence when you're in the middle of that story. Maybe you're in that story right now. Maybe you're in the middle of a scary medical diagnosis, or a passing with somebody that you love. Or if you're younger, you just found out that you're not going to the college that you always thought you were going to go to. Or maybe there's this hard breakup and you're like, I don't know if I could get through this. You're in the middle of the story and you don't know how God's going to make something good out of it. As a matter of fact, you don't have the confidence to say that. I'll give you an example from my story. When I was in high school, and for those of you who know me, everything I did up to then was all related to art. I didn't speak English when I was in the first grade, and so I always drew something to explain, like, I need to go to the bathroom, so I draw a toilet and say, gotta go to the bathroom. So drawing became like second nature to me, right? And so I just assumed that my future was in art. I applied to art schools, and I got into all of them, and I was ready to go to art school, and then my mom said, you're not going to art school because it doesn't pay. Right? So I became a pastor. And it just so happened that I got into UCLA, so I said, okay, Mom, I'm going to go to UCLA. So I went to UCLA, and the whole time I was looking at the art programs. I'm like, okay, well, what kind of art programs does UCLA have? And I'm like, oh, is it too late for me to apply? And it's not the kind of art that I was looking for. I'm not, and I should go into production art. I was looking at everything. And eventually, like my third year, I was undeclared in my major for 3 years. I didn't know what I was going to do in college. And as I was looking at all that, I kept on thinking, like, I can't wait to get out of here. I can't wait to get out of here. And as I was wondering that, like, they're like, you got to declare a major before you get out of this school. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to find the major that's easiest to graduate from. And so I said, well, I'm Japanese. I'll do a Japan major or East Asian Studies major. Or I just couldn't wait to get out of school. And I'm like, as soon as I graduate, I'm going to go to art school and then, make my mom happy. Then I'll go to art school to make myself happy and so forth. But as it turns out, when I was at UCLA, I met a lot of great friends. While I was at UCLA, which was only like 10 miles from the church I was attending at the time, that I started working at the church, and that's when I felt my calling. I'm like, oh, I think I'm called to be a pastor, right? And it's not only that. When I was at UCLA, it's where I met my wife, and I got to know her more. And so in hindsight, I could say, right? It's like, oh, it all makes sense that God took something that I didn't wish upon myself, but something beautiful came out of it, right? I found my calling. I found my wife, right? But while you're in the middle of it, I'm like, I just can't wait to get out of school, because this isn't where I'm supposed to be. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Maybe you guys could relate. In hindsight, it's easy to tell where God was working, but we're in the middle of it. It's hard to tell. Well, today what we're going to do is we're going to be looking through a letter written by a guy named Paul. Paul, when he wrote this letter, is in jail. He's in prison. And it's not like the prisons today. I don't know if anybody here has been in prison today. But basically, the conditions were worse back then. Okay, so here's like artist rendering of what a prison in Rome looked like. So this is like the sidewalk over here. You walk in, right? And the prison is actually down here. The walls are made out of stone. And there's no sunlight except for this hole right here, which has this hole up here, so like you get a little bit of light. If the sun's not right above you, it's like really hard to see, And it gets really cold down here because it's underground and there's no insulation. So you have to imagine, so I think I mentioned this last week, but Paul writes a letter to his friend Timothy at one point where he says, like, please bring me a cloak because I'm getting really cold down here. This is why he asked for that. He has no food unless some of his friends come in knocking on the door saying, I'm here to deliver food for Paul. They were under no obligation to feed their prisoner. Right? Here's a picture, next one, of what it might have looked like. This is a prison that you could go to today, a prison in Rome. Not sure if this is the prison that Paul was in, but this is the condition that he was in, and he didn't know. Even in his letter, he even says, I don't know what waits for me for after this. Like he thinks that this is the last few days of his life, although he does live a little past this. Paul is convinced that this might be the end for me, guys. In the letter he writes, this might be the end. But for some reason, he's able to write a letter at this point in the story of his life to say, guys, God's going to bring something good out of this. Where does he get that confidence from? So let's take a look at that letter. This is the book of Philippians chapter 1. We're starting in verse 12 today. So he's writing a letter to a church that's far, far away in a place called Philippi. That's why it's called Philippians. This is what he says. Now, I want you to know, brothers and sisters is code for Christians. Now I want you to know, Christians, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. In case you don't know, gospel here basically says, in a very, very broad terms, he's basically saying, hey, guys, I know that love reigns, love rules, because God is love, and God is sitting at the top. He's like sitting on the throne of the universe. The Romans, they think that Caesar's sitting on the throne, and they believe that violence rules. We're both trying to achieve peace. Romans think that we could achieve peace by destroying the people who disagrees with us. Jesus says, no, we don't believe in violence. What we believe is that we are going to conquer the world through love. We're going to gain people to join our movement through love. We don't believe in hurting somebody. We believe in turning our cheek. We believe in giving somebody, being generous towards people, not by taking away things if they don't agree with us. Okay, so, and Jesus, the God who died on the cross and rose again, he resurrected to show that love reigns. Okay, so that's in a nutshell. So he says, me being in chains here, me being in prison and living under these terrible conditions, here's the silver lining. People are learning about Jesus and his movement. Oh, how's that, Paul? Well, take a look. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I'm in chains for Christ. This is really cool what he's saying. Like, guys, do you understand what's happened? For years and years and years, I've been trying to think, how do I tell more people about Jesus? Right? And the most powerful force in the world at the time were the Roman Empire. And he's like, how do I get, if I could get the Roman Empire to know about Jesus, they will spread it for me, right? So he's like, how do I penetrate into the Roman Empire? And it turns out like, wait a minute, guys, I'm in chains. And when I want to leave my prison just to get a breath of fresh air, I have to be chained to one of these Roman guards. When I'm chained to them, they have to listen to me. So I've been telling them about the love of Jesus, okay? And the longer I'm here, the more guards get to hear about Jesus. And these people, they've transformed. Like, they're like, are you serious? You're telling me that the way of Caesar is not the way to go, but the way of Jesus is the way to go? And Paul's like, yeah, that's how you're supposed to do it. I get to explain why I'm in chains right now. Like, oh, Paul, why are you here? Why are you so happy? Because I get to tell you about Jesus, right? Because of the bad circumstance I'm in, you would think I'd be down on myself. But Paul says, actually, it's actually worked in the opposite. Because I'm here, the mission is actually going forward. And then he continues. And because of my chains, most of the other Christians, brothers and sisters, have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. There are other Christians out there who are hearing these stories. Did you hear about Paul? Yeah, I heard he went to jail. But guess what? Because he's in jail, more people are learning about Jesus. And because of that, the Roman guards are like gung-ho about Jesus. They're telling other guards and more guards. Maybe eventually Caesar will hear about it too, right? And they're like, wait a minute. You mean that if we get tortured for what we're teaching, it might actually work for the good of the world? It's like, yeah. It's like, oh my gosh. And so all of a sudden, the people who are outside of prison are starting to gain more confidence, right? So like Paul's like, do you see how God could take something terrible and make something good come out of it? So let me map this out for you guys. The goal, Paul's original goal was, I want everyone to know the gospel. I want everybody to know about Jesus, right? But the problem is, I'm stuck in prison. And so what God does here is he says, well, let me see. Maybe I could give you a new goal, and this new goal is even more beautiful than the original goal. So the new goal he gives them is everyone here, the prison guards, know the gospel now. It's like, wow. Because through the guards, it's actually penetrating, and from the inside out, the gospel is spreading. Now, it turns out that wasn't the only problem that Paul came across. Like, if that was the only problem, he's like, look, problem solved. Boom. There's another problem that's happening. And Paul writes about that in the next verse. This is what he says. It is true, the rumors that you heard, that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry. There's people out there who are talking about Jesus for the wrong reasons, but others out of goodwill. The people with goodwill do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. Okay, next. The former, the people who are spreading the gospel for the wrong reasons, they preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. Okay, here's a scenario that's happening. Imagine if there's like a person outside of prison that's talking, right? It's like, hey, psst, did you hear about that guy named Paul? Yeah, that crazy guy. He's in jail right now. He's in chains. It's like, oh yeah, I heard he is a pretty crazy guy. It's like, yeah, how did he end up there? It's like, well, he thinks that there's this guy named Jesus who was killed for loving people and that kind of stuff. It's like, yeah, yeah. Well, I heard he claims that he rose from the grave. It's like, what? What a crazy guy Paul is that thinks that somebody who died rose again on the third day. It's like, yeah. And did you know there's a thing called a church that started up because of that? It's like, what's a church? Well, the church is something that goes around and loves people unconditionally. It's like, that is crazy right now. That's what's happening. They're trying to spread rumors about Paul because of the claim that he is crazy for being in, like, is this worth going to jail for? You know, that kind of thing, right? But in the process of making fun of Paul, people are learning about Jesus. Does it make sense? Right? So the goal that Paul had originally was, I want everyone to know the gospel. The second problem is that some are spreading lies about me, Paul would say. People are mocking me. People are making fun of me. Right? But this is Paul's response to that. Look at this. But what does it matter? Like, people are making fun of me outside these walls? I don't care. I don't care about that. The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. I know they're making fun of me. I don't care. But guess what? People are learning about Jesus' death and resurrection. Like, even, I'm the end of the joke, right? But in telling that joke, people are hearing about Jesus, right? And because of that, I think this is great. He's like, I think I get to rejoice. I'm excited because they're doing the work that I wish I could be doing out there. They're doing it out there for me. Right? So if the original goal was, I want everyone to know the gospel, the problem is that, the people are spreading lies about me, they're making fun of me. He says, well, God set a new goal for me. More people are hearing about Jesus because of the way they're making fun of me. Like, yeah, sure, I'm being mocked and everything, but in the process of mocking me, people are hearing more and more about Jesus. So I guess that's a win, right? So in the midst of our misfortunes, God will birth a new goal. This is what he's talking about. So, for example, in your situation, you're like, my relationship isn't going the way it's supposed to. And because of that, I have to make some difficult choices in my life. And those difficult decisions have led me to this kind of life, or I have to move to this place of the country, or whatever. And in that, you find something beautiful. He gave you a new goal, right? There's a big baseball game today. You guys heard? No? Okay. Got gloomy really fast. Okay. Have you considered that if I'm not saying we are, but if we lose, okay, we have to make some expectation changes, right? We have to, I don't know, things are going to change if things don't go the way we want it to go. But have you considered the other side of the story? That there might be fans on the other side who are really counting on them to, like you have to consider that you're not the main character of the story. It's like when we're praying and praying for the good parking spot, right? And sometimes you pray and the parking spot opens and you pull in, you're like, yes, we're so close to the grocery store or whatever. But sometimes we pray and pray and pray and the parking spot never opens, so you're driving around, and then one spot opens and it's the furthest one from the place you want to go. You know what I'm talking about? This happens to us at Disneyland all the time. We're like, and the parking lot's so big that when you walk, it's like about a mile before. You're tired even before you get into the park, right? And then you park, and this is the worst part, right? When you walk closer and closer to the entrance, you see the spot open up and another car pulls in. But have you considered that you're not the main character of this story? That the new goal is maybe the person who parked in the spot that you wanted was the person who really needed that spot. Maybe they have back pains. Maybe that person had a really bad day. Maybe that person is in a rush to get somewhere and their stakes are a lot higher than yours. Sometimes bad things happen and God would look at that and say, hey, I could use that to bless somebody else. Sometimes we're not the main character of the story. Maybe we didn't get into the college we wanted, but you got to another college and you find something beautiful there. And the whole future, your trajectory changes into something better than you could have ever imagined. Maybe someone's trying to ruin your life intentionally. But then God takes that and says, yes, they are. And yes, your life is going to be hard from here on out. But because of your hardship, maybe something down the line, you're going to be blessing somebody else. Maybe your children, they're living a life that you didn't wish upon them. You can't agree with what they're doing with their lives right now. And because of that, it's affected you, and you're stressed out all the time. But maybe there's something beautiful that's supposed to come out of that, because that's what God does. Joseph was able to say that in hindsight. Paul, who read the Old Testament, is very familiar with the Joseph story. And maybe he read that story and he has it memorized, and he was like, you know what? I know the Joseph story. I'm in chains right now. I don't see any way out of this, but I already see something beautiful coming out of this. He's able to remove himself from the situation and look at it from God's eyes and say, wow, can you believe what happened here? Now, I want to make some things clear, because I don't want to make a promise to everybody here saying like, hey, if you had a bad life, then something good is right around the corner, because sometimes that doesn't happen. So let's take a look at Joseph's life. Joseph was taken away from his family, and so by the time he ends up in the cistern, he's thinking, I want to get back to my old life, right? He was sold into slavery, and he's like, I don't have a family anymore. But eventually he gets to Egypt and he finds a new family. Although the Potiphar's wife betrays him, and then he's thrown into prison, right? He's in prison for 10 years. He's wrongfully accused. He's thinking like, I don't have a family again. Every step of the way, what do you think Joseph was wishing for? He was probably wishing, I wish I could be with my dad again. I haven't seen him in over a decade. I wish I could be with my brothers. As evil as they were, I miss them, right? Or maybe they're like, I wish I could be under Potiphar again. But was he able to go back to his homeland? No. He had to say that life is dead. When you ask God and say, God, I know that something good's going to come out of this terrible life I'm living right now, do you always wish for something that was in the past? Or do you wish for something in the future that doesn't resemble what looked like in the past, but you just trust that God has something better in the future? Because what Joseph was given at the end of the story was not his old life. What he was given was an opportunity to save Egypt and Israel, the whole nation. Right? I know we have a tendency of looking at this story and saying like, well, remember, Joseph started off as a son, the 11th youngest son, right? Or the second youngest. But at the end of the story, he's the second most powerful person in Egypt. Like, look at that. Like, I want to be that, right? But that's not the point of this story. This story is not about Joseph. This story is about God and the nations, and how the person who came from here ended up saving the whole world. Look at Paul's life. Paul, his life was threatened. He used to be a respected Jewish scholar, a Pharisee, a rabbi. Everywhere he went, everybody knew his name. He was a very respected person, and now he had this encounter with Jesus. He fell in love with Jesus. He knew that the love of Jesus can change the world. And because of that, his life was threatened. He was thrown into prison, not just once. We know of at least 2 times he was thrown into prison, maybe more than that. He's been in shipwrecks. He almost died several times. He doesn't have a family. I don't know if you know this, but scholars think that at one point he might have been married. We don't know, but he had no children. Or if he did, those children want nothing to do with his father anymore because of his status. He lost everything. He was wrongfully accused all the time. Every time he ended up in a city, there were people in the city that would always chase him out. He died homeless. He didn't have a home. He went from a well-respected scholar to a person who made tents for a living. And when he wrote the letters that he wrote, that's now in our Bible, he's writing letters saying, guys, like, I don't have anything except for this gospel that I hang on to. But because of this, right, he's like, I think something good's going to come out of it. Did anything good come out of it for Paul? Answer is no. Paul was eventually killed. Paul was eventually isolated. Nothing good came out of this for Paul. But something good did come out for the world. Many people in this world are now experiencing heaven on earth because of Paul. Right? We're not the main character of this story. He saves the world. Joseph saves the world. Paul is saving the world, right? Paul got the short end of the stick. There wasn't there was not much in it for Paul in this story. But because he was able to say, there's something good that's going to come out of this torture I'm going through right now, he was able to push himself to the side and let God do the work and bring something beautiful out of it. That's what Paul meant in this letter when he said, I believe something beautiful is going to come out of this. And look, I already see two things that are happening, right? The people, the Roman guards, they are learning who Jesus is. And there are people out there who are learning about Jesus because I'm the end of their mocking. Like they're mocking me, they're making jokes about me. But because of that, more and more people are knowing about Jesus. And I'm okay being that guy. So it doesn't necessarily mean that your life is going to be better. But the faith that Paul has is, I'm willing to take this unfortunate life if it means that the world is going to be better for it. So, what difficulty are you experiencing right now? And I think we should do everything we can to support each other to help people get out of difficulties or get through the difficulties that they're in. But there's going to come a time in your life when you're saying, I'm just going to accept the fact that this is my life. Because I believe that from this difficulty, God is going to do something beautiful. That beautiful thing might not be for me. It might be for the society or the communities around me. But I believe that God's going to do something beautiful out of this. And if you ever get to a point where you're like, but I don't know if I really believe that, Paul would say, well, let's look at our past. In hindsight, what beautiful things have risen from the misfortunes of your past? Look back to your life and see what has God done out of the misfortunes of my past, and let that be the motivation and the confidence to fuel your current situation right now. And for those of you who've lived a longer life than me, you probably have a lot of stories that you could share with me. Whenever I'm in that situation, you could probably share stories with me like, hey, Kotz, when I was your age or when I was like this age, I went through this, and I was completely convinced nothing good could come out of it. But let me tell you, something good did come out of it. And because of that, the world is better. I'm sure you guys have stories like that. And so this is why it's so important for older generations to pour into the younger generation. Because for people like me and people who are younger than me, they don't see anything past their current struggles. They don't have stories to point to in the past and say, like, hey, this is something that I experienced in the past. They don't have stories like that. This is why it's so important that we have intergenerational community. The kind of stories that I have are stories like, well, I was at Disneyland, I was trying to find a parking spot. That's the kind of stories I have, right? But you guys have stories like, well, let me tell you about the internment camps. Well, let me tell you about the time when I was racially profiled. Well, let me tell you about the time when I couldn't get that job just because of my gender. Or do you have stories about, Kotz, do you know how difficult it was to navigate through a world being somebody because I'm not straight, people have judged me in a certain way. Do you know what it feels like to be like that? But let me tell you, Kotz, something beautiful came out of that. I don't have stories like that, but some of you do. And this is why it's so important that we keep talking to each other and discussing issues with each other and encouraging each other. Today, I hope the Dodgers win. I hope, right? But I know for my family, sometimes it's hard to see beyond just a baseball game, okay, right? And it's important for people who have these experiences to share with people like us to say, hey, look, I don't know if you guys heard, but the admission for Disneyland went up, and they're like, that's the worst thing that could ever happen to me in my life. Right? On Facebook, people are talking about, my life is over because the magic key just went up by $100 or whatever, right? It's important for people who have better and more deep experiences to share their stories with people like us because we're very shallow. So the point is, we don't just pick up truth like this just by reading a Bible story. Bible stories give us insight and gives words to the things that we're experiencing. But without those experiences, it's really hard to understand that God is truly working in the midst of the ashes to bring something beautiful out of it. Amen? All right, let's pray.